Hello, everyone. So I'm not a neuroscientist. That was Dr. Levitin, by the way, starting that applause. So I actually started as a music teacher. I worked in the public schools of Hopewell Valley in New Jersey, just outside of Princeton, New Jersey, in a relatively affluent district that had a lot of respect and desire among the parents for arts education for their children. And I worked there for most of my teaching career. And I got my master's degree at Northwestern in the summers, so I didn't have to quit teaching while I could still go back to the classroom and actually actively make music with students. And a lot of my parents of the students I worked with worked at the university, at Princeton University nearby. A lot of them worked for the Educational Testing Service. And so advocacy for music education in Hopewell was sort of an interesting thing because we had a really well-informed populace that we worked with. And one year, at an open public board meeting, the then Board of Education appointed superintendent said about an innovative program that we had called Primary Strings that was sort of Suzuki-inspired, where every child in every elementary school in Hopewell Valley started on a string instrument in first and second grade, in addition to compulsory general music instruction, which is vocal music and things like that. She said in an open public board meeting that this program needed to come to an end, and if parents wanted their children to study music, they were free to pay for them privately out of school time. And I happened to be at that board meeting, and the next day I applied for PhD programs. I did, because I was concerned about this sort of idea percolating up through public policymakers, particularly if that could happen in a district such as Hopewell. I wanted to know what was going on in the broader world. And so through that, I'm happy to say, by the way, that that superintendent no longer works in that district. My research interest has sort of been sparked by that one moment. I can really point to it, that my interest in what music education is and what it does for kids and how it's represented in public policy sort of comes from that. And based on the work that we've just heard today, you understand that there is a scientific basis for arts education being central or essential in the public schools here in the United States and not just peripheral. Yet, the current state of arts education policy in the United States is fragmented and uneven. There's systematic variation in access and uptake to certain kinds of arts education with factors like geography, race and ethnicity, social class, and parental education, to name just a few. We are beginning to understand more about the disparities in access and uptake of arts education from the social scientific research of music education and arts education, work that my colleagues and I publish in journals like Arts Education Policy Review, Art Education, the Journal of Research in Music Education, and others. Actually, as Dr. Levitin mentioned, the sort of inquiry in music and arts education as an area of scientific study really does have its roots in psychology. From psychology, a lot of different areas that my colleagues study have sort of really blossomed into ways that are now influenced more by things like sociology, by actually economics, and some of the other social sciences. There's a vibrant literature of research within arts education broadly that looks at just some of these topics. Today, what I'm going to do is share with you an overview of the state of arts education policy in the United States and how research has shown these policies are shaping who has access to music education and who elects to take music education once it becomes optional. I conclude with just a little bit on the current arts education policy situation with the recent passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act, which if you're not an education policy wonk, you may have not heard of before I just mentioned those words. So when we think about arts education policy, we primarily think about four levers that education policymakers have to influence arts education. At the elementary and middle school levels, these are primarily devoted to how much instructional time is offered in each of the various arts disciplines. At the high school level, some states require that high schools make certain arts programs available to their students. Others have graduation requirements explicitly for the arts. Some states and some localities have chosen to work through certain levers and not others. So you end up with some things that seem inconsistent. For example, Michigan does not by law require that high schools in Michigan offer arts instruction, and yet you must take a class in the arts to graduate high school in Michigan. So obviously they're working through the fourth lever, not the third lever. But these sort of policies form the premise upon which arts education should be built here in the United States. So in terms of where elementary arts instruction is required, and just a brief little break, I'm about to present state-level data using a colored-in map of the United States. I recognize that many of you may not want to view a colored-in map of the United States right now, but it is the easiest way to display these data. So at the elementary level, actually, the vast majority of states require... they're deliberately purple. So the elementary level, the vast majority of states require at least some instructional time per week devoted to music, visual art, dance, and/or drama. In fact, this is all states except for Alaska, Colorado, the District of Columbia, Hawaii, Michigan, and South Dakota. When we go to the middle school level, we notice that, now we notice it. We notice that actually, I'm gonna have to go back because there was a big transition there. Elementary, middle. So the map doesn't change, right? It's the same essential states require at least some instructional time during the middle school week be devoted to art education. When we go to high school arts instruction, this is where we get a little bit more nuance. Many states require that some instruction in the arts be offered, but this is not the same as requiring that those students actually enroll in the classes. So in addition to Alaska, Colorado, DC, Hawaii, Michigan, and South Dakota, Idaho does not have any requirement for public high schools to offer any arts instruction whatsoever. When we look at graduation requirements, the map changes drastically. What I like to refer to as strict high school arts graduation requirements are those where the students must meet the requirement by actually taking a class in visual art, music, dance, or drama. And we notice that the strict mandates are only in 26 states, including the District of Columbia, Arkansas, Connecticut, DC, Delaware, Florida, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maine, Maryland, Michigan, Minnesota, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, Ohio, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, Washington, West Virginia, and Wyoming. Now, to these states, we add what I like to refer to as a flexible arts mandate. And actually, these are states where students can meet this particular graduation requirement by taking a class in music, visual arts, dance, or drama, or by some other element that is not reading or math. Typically, we see things in the vocational and technical arts combined with the visual and performing arts for these flexible mandates. And so we have additional 15 states that have flexible arts graduation requirements. Alabama, Arizona, California, Georgia, Hawaii, Idaho, Illinois, Indiana, Nevada, North Carolina, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Oregon, Rhode Island, and Virginia. You know, I studied at Northwestern University, and Chicago is an interesting case because Chicago requires arts instruction of all of their high school graduates from the CPS, the Chicago Public Schools, but there are virtually no arts programs in any of the K-8 schools throughout the city. Sometimes private organizations have arisen to meet that need, so many students in Chicago receive choral music education from things like the Chicago Children's Chorus, which is a quite large private nonprofit endeavor to get kids singing, and CPS has formed a partnership with them where they allow CCC, the Children's Chorus, to come in and use school facilities, and they do this at no cost to the school district, which is sort of an interesting setting because that puts essentially the main way that these students interact with music and the arts as to something that is completely and totally outside of the school day. Philosophically, I have problems with that, even though I, at the same time, recognize the great work that's being done by my colleagues at CCC and in other situations like that. So if these are the policy premises upon which arts education is supposed to be founded, what's actually going on the schools? Well, so this comes from data that were first compiled by the National Center for Education Statistics, and I'm pulling things from their published report as well as I have a license for their data to go through and do some of my own analyses that I'm presenting here. And we can recognize that at the elementary level, for the most part, these numbers are somewhat encouraging. 94% of elementary schools offer at least some instruction in music, 83% in visual art, and then you notice a steep cliff for dance and drama. The unfortunate part about this particular set of numbers, even though it might seem encouraging, is that remember, nearly all states in the union require instructional time in music and the arts to be offered at the elementary level. So I actually think these numbers should be quite higher than they are. And as I mentioned earlier, we start to see, when you look at crosstabs, some interesting patterns. So when we look at region of the country, Northeast, Southeast, Central, and West, and discipline, we notice that music, by far, has the most sort of market penetration of any of the arts in elementary schools. And there's some slight variation by region of the country. Visual art, less than music, but again, still fairly well represented. Dance, again, falling off that cliff. And drama at the elementary level, not much better than dance. Now, when we look at other areas that we know to be related to education and music, things like proportion of students who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch, we start to see some different things. So more than 1 in 10 schools serving the highest concentrations of students eligible for free or reduced price lunch offer no music instruction. And I should give you a little bit of context to this. Music instruction, for the purposes of this data collection, could have been as little as 15 minutes once per week. So schools that are represented in offering music instruction might not be offering music for even 20 minutes once per week. 2 in 10 of those schools have no visual art component being offered, again, for as little as 15 minutes once per week. When we look at dance, I mean, this is similar to what we saw in the overall number, so it's probably not surprising. And then, of course, we need to look at the proportion of students of color, which, of course, in the United States is going to be often conflated with issues of socioeconomic status. So music, again, offers the highest market penetration of any of the arts. Visual art, again, you notice decreasing numbers as the proportion of students of color increases in a school. Dance and drama. So the average elementary arts education experience, once you sort of look at this in totality, is the average student in the United States gets about 44 minutes of instruction per class, and the arts are offered about once to twice per week. The modal experience is about 45 minutes of instruction in what we call general music, so that's not necessarily choir or chorus, but some sort of music appreciation or making of music, and visual art once each per week. The important caveat to the sort of modal experience, however, is that the 17% of elementary schools with no art and the 6% of elementary schools with no music disproportionately serve students of color or students or are located in areas of concentrated poverty. What we see down there is just a little quick Rouse-Scott chi-square that's a non-parametric test of association for clustered data. And you see that essentially all of those relationships are significant with the exception of the visual art and students of color. Looking at the secondary schools, there's a sort of a different pattern emerges. We actually have less overall in music and visual art, but dance and drama start to increase rapidly. When we look at the same sort of crosstabs by discipline and region, we start to notice a little bit more variation, particularly in the western part of the United States. Visual art, similar to music. Dance is growing, and then drama. It's interesting to me that drama is most prevalent in the western part of the United States, whereas music is the least, but that's because I'm a musician, and so I just find that to be interesting. An area that becomes of more salience when you look at secondary schools is actually the size of the school, because size of school is often related to the resources that schools can devote to teachers. And so you notice a really interesting pattern where as school size increases, the probability that a school offers instruction in all 4 of the visual and performing arts does increase, sort of monotonically. So small schools not necessarily better for the arts. When you look at discipline and urbanicity, you see things that might jive with what you would expect. City being a center of an urban area, suburb being outlying a metropolitan statistical area, town being not quite rural. This goes by population numbers, and then rural, of course. These are NCES, the National Center for Education Statistics, designations of place. Visual art, dance, and drama. And then for secondary access, we also see the relationship with students receiving free and reduced price lunch. As the proportion of concentrated poverty increases, the likelihood of the school offering a robust program in the arts decreases. And then when we see, in terms of race and ethnicity, different patterns emerge for the arts disciplines. Music and art are less likely to be offered at secondary schools with greater proportions of students who do not identify as white, but dance and drama are more prevalent at secondary schools with greater proportions of students identifying as races other than white. So in my own work, I like to look at the demographics of music students. So if we are interested in figuring out once music becomes completely elective and not compulsory, which is typically at 6th grade, you start to see differential patterns of who's actually taking music in the public schools. So in the high schools, music ensembles are elected by about 1/3, give or take, of students. But when you look at the characteristics of those students who earn their music credit in an ensemble, you start to notice that there are some fundamental differences between the students who are in music and the students who aren't in music. And so for this study, what we did was just sort of simply look in a univariate way at certain characteristics, and we found that these 5 areas were sort of related to who actually receives music instruction in the schools. And then you're sort of looking down into the association to see who's underrepresented and overrepresented. So males underrepresented among music students is entirely driven by the fact that more female students take choir. So that's just an interesting thing from a choir teacher perspective. Students of Hispanic or Latino ethnicity are significantly underrepresented among music students, those in the lowest SES quartile, those who are native Spanish speakers. And then there's a strong relationship between who takes music and parental education. So parents with a high school diploma or less are considerably less likely to have their students in music. Parents who have an advanced degree are considerably more likely. And at a meeting such as this, where probably everyone in this room has at least one advanced degree, it's hard to recognize that people who hold advanced degrees in the United States are by far a minority of the population. When you look at scale, about some of the benefits that we've seen, which clearly have biological bases based on what we're finding out in neuroscience research, some of which we've reviewed today, you sort of get a very interesting relationship. When we look at the SAT, which is a common advocacy claim for music, we actually find that when we control for these sort of systematic differences between who does and does not take music at the high school level, that the effect of music doesn't seem to show up in SAT scores. SAT score, this is on the 1600 scale, so 100 points is a standard deviation. And you notice before we control, it looks like the music students are doing about a third of a standard deviation better than the non-music students. But music is such an unevenly distributed resource in the United States that once you start controlling for these population differences, the variation washes away. If you look at a temporally ordered analysis where students didn't take music until 11th grade, they actually, it's not significant, but they underperform non-music students, which is sort of an interesting side effect of what we found in that particular study. Another question might be the effect of policy. So in policy analysis for No Child Left Behind, the most common way that No Child Left Behind has been analyzed is through interrupted time series or comparative interrupted time series, comparing the public schools to the private schools, because the public schools were not, or excuse me, the public schools were subject to No Child Left Behind while the private schools were not. And essentially looking at enrollment patterns in music prior to No Child Left Behind in public schools compared to private schools, we use a difference in differences approach. And statistically, the dashed line for private school enrollment in music prior to No Child Left Behind is not different, nor is the slope, from the public school enrollment, which is the solid blue line. And actually, because of the small number of data point collections that were nationally representative post No Child Left Behind, the trend line and the difference in the post No Child Left Behind era also do not rise to be statistically significantly different, which would tend to suggest that No Child Left Behind had no effect on who was taking music, which is really interesting because a lot of the education advocacy around No Child Left Behind was about narrowing the curriculum. However, the theory of action for No Child Left Behind was very firmly centered around disaggregating data by subgroups. So you could have schools that prior to No Child Left Behind looked like they were doing great because their average scores were high, but if you dug down into subgroups by things like students receiving special needs services under an IEP or race and ethnicity, that there actually were tremendous disparities in who was and wasn't achieving. It's harder to compare because we don't have enough data and national data collections on the private schools for students in the subgroup. So we use a short interrupted time series approach without a comparison group. It's not ideal. We essentially compare the post-No Child Left Behind observation to the pre-No Child Left Behind trend. I'm going to try to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good in that analysis. But what we find is that students with IEPs were actually, there's evidence here to suggest that students with IEPs, those are students who are classified as having special needs, were underrepresented in music programs in the No Child Left Behind era, and that a trend that had been increasing potentially turned negative. And also students of Hispanic or Latino origin, also essentially when you compare to the pre-No Child Left Behind trend, appear to be even more underrepresented in music during the No Child Left Behind era. The overall numbers looking the same are counterbalanced by these two drops by a significant increase in the proportion of Asian and Asian American students among music programs in the No Child Left Behind era. So where are we now in terms of policy? Well, as I mentioned before, we are now in the world of the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. ESSA was passed and signed into law with both bipartisan and bicameral support in late 2015 and is referred to among DC education policy wonks as a Christmas miracle. The most important element for those of us who are interested in arts and arts education is that the arts collectively and music individually are now separately enumerated as part of ESSA's well-rounded curriculum definition, which replaces former language in No Child Left Behind that defined core academic subjects. ESSA, though, sends to the states much of that which had been centralized under No Child Left Behind, which means that the advocacy fight for those of us who are interested in arts and education goes away from the federal level and to the 50 state boards of education and state legislatures. The most important remaining federal ask for those of us who are interested in arts education policy is for Congress to fully fund Title IV Part A, which is the funding mechanism where states can apportion federal dollars to advance education in all of these enumerated subjects, which means Title IV Part A as well as Title I funds can be spent by schools in support of music and arts education. And ESSA is the first time in federal policy that that's been specifically allowed. It's never been withheld before, but the fact that it's been specifically allowed is quite good. Full funding for Title IV Part A is $1.56 billion. The most recent funding proposal that went forth was for $300 million, which for people in the arts education advocacy field firmly believe that at those levels of funding across all 20 of these subjects, across all 50 states and all school districts in the nation is essentially going to be meaningless. So that's why they're currently looking for Title IV Part A full funding. That is the federal ask. So that's where we are. Thank you very much.